Welcome to the Belonging Project. The Belonging Project has the purpose to share real life and powerful global conversation that offer inspiration and practical strategies to anyone who is on the path to find a true voice in society, in life, and as a leader, their journey towards true belonging. This conversation is exactly what it needs to be today at this point in time. We are asking our guests to join us by video to allow us to create an even deeper connection. Our rules for our conversation today. Number 1, nobody gets to be wrong or right. Number 2, emotions are always welcome here. Number 3, come as you are, everything is included. Number 4, everybody gets to be vulnerable. We love talking about wins, success, but also we love talking about challenges and failures even more.
And our guest today is Nicole Barile. Nicole is founder of NB Intercultural, creating globally minded leaders and organizations around the globe. Previously, Nicole worked as executive director of an intercultural consulting company in New York City for 10 years before relocating to Cleveland, Ohio, and head up the Intercultural Training Division firm. She has traveled to over 40 countries, has lived in Mexico and Argentina, and speaks conversational Portuguese, we can do this, and Spanish. She received her BA Bachelor in Global Economics and MA in Intercultural Relations. Nicole is a regular presenter, speaker, and writer on the topics of global leadership, cultural competences, doing business across borders, and working on multicultural teams. Dear Nicole, thank you so much for being here with us in our Belonging Project.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much, Andrea and Fiorenza, for having me.
Wonderful. So, in order to get started here, we would like you to share your story with us. What's Nicole's story?
Yeah, sure. So my story, I guess, as it pertains to belonging and the work I do, I think started as a young age because my mom was a teacher and she used to travel every summer before she had kids. And so growing up, I always heard these stories of her going to Greece or to Japan and just was always learning about other places. And then that kind of drove my curiosity. And I grew up in New York, just outside of New York City. And so my grandmother lived in the city. And so we were always there every month or more. And so also that was an opportunity for me to always hear other languages and just see people from different backgrounds. So I was always curious about travel and culture. And then fast forward, I studied abroad, like you said, in Argentina. And when I came back, coincidentally, I found out from a professor of mine that intercultural training was a career, right? So it was a field that you could actually be in. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly for me. And then a couple years later, I got a job in New York. And so unlike a lot of, I think, intercultural trainers in this space, I actually started on the operations side. So more managing programs and designing content and things like that. And then later I fell into the consulting space. So that's just a quick, my story of kind of how I got to where I am today. And about 3 years ago, I had went out on my own to offer services. So I had always been more, like I said, on the operations side, but doing consulting kind of on the side. It wasn't my main job. I mean, I just loved it. And so I wanted to see, what things, like kind of what you two are doing on your, like what kind of cool, creative things can I create on my own? And so I decided to make that leap 3 years ago. And I've been working with global companies, helping develop global leaders. And it ties very much into this idea of belonging, right? Because I think that's what it boils down to. You want to understand people from other cultures, but not just to, improve sales, right? or I don't know, any metrics or improve revenue, things like that. Of course, that's important, but it's really building those relationships and making others feel like they belong too. So.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Nicole, what comes to mind when you think of belonging?
So for me, and this is a tricky one. I've thought about this a lot. So there can be many things, but I feel like it's, when you say that somebody gets you, right? Like that's what I think for me personally, it boils down to, right? Because even though I'm a white woman living in the United States where I was born, I've still felt like I didn't belong in places. And I tried to think like, why was that? And I just felt like people didn't get me. And, and to kind of get a little personal. So I'm not religious, but I grew up with a Jewish Eastern European mother and an Italian Catholic father. And so even though, yes, like I said, I'm white, I'm American, I always felt kind of both of those things, right? And so when I grew up, I couldn't even choose a religion because I had one parent that was one and one that was another. And so if I was hanging out with just Jewish family or friends, I didn't feel 100% like I belonged there because I felt like I couldn't identify 100% with everything. I knew some of the holidays and some of the Yiddish words or Hebrew words, but that was it, and the same thing with the Italian side. And so, so it just feels like, I think belonging is when somebody gets you, you have that connection with someone. So, if you're at the workplace, I've worked at places or a place before where I didn't feel like I belonged so much. And I think it was partly because there was no recognition of like other holidays or, religious traditions or cultural traditions, because the majority of the people were probably, and I'm probably assuming, but I think the majority of the people there were from a similar background. And so I kind of always felt a little bit different, even though they didn't do anything on purpose to make me feel excluded, but I did feel slightly excluded and like I didn't belong.
Yes, and it's not an easy feeling. This is why it's so in our core, because now Fiorenza and I, we have 30 cultural kids, and now Fiorenza is a 30 kid herself, and this like hard feeling, it's sometimes always present, regardless your skin color or the situation. Like in your case, it was religious situation. For some people could be racist, or no, it's the belonging is very, very vast. Now there is not one box to fill, but could be very different in that way. And even with your personal experience, and even now being such an expert in the intercultural field, how this belonging, or even this I get you, or I understand you, could differentiate if you know from your knowledge and expertise in the cultural differences that, or even in the workplace. How do you see this happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I see it show up the most, and like when I talk to clients, is a lot of times, right, it's unconscious bias, right? It's things people don't realize that they're doing. And I think a lot of it is, when people talk about culture fit, right? So I think that's how it shows up in the workplace. People don't realize they say they say, yeah, well, we have to have someone that fits our culture here. And yes, that's important, but what does that actually mean? So, and I think a lot of times that's where people get excluded. They might not fit that typical idea within that organization of what a good employee looks like, right? And so then it has, as you both know, right, I think people don't realize the larger implications that it can have, right? So someone might be passed up for a promotion because it looks like they don't have the right qualifications, for example. But it could just be that they're from a different background, they're from a different culture, and how they exhibit leadership skills is going to be different. So I think, and tying it to belonging, right? I think that people that are excluded in that way, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they're more likely to leave the organization, right? So I think it is a serious issue. It's one that I feel like people don't talk about as much. So I'm glad you're doing this, right? I mean, to go to the idea of, I'm just thinking of this, like the idea of me, going to my HR department and saying, hey, I don't feel like I belong here. I don't think that would have crossed my mind to do that.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people probably don't speak up about that feeling. They just will leave.
Yeah. Or this idea to try to, this was my experience when I was in Italy and I was in HR, to try to fit in.
Yeah, that too.
Create that, try to belong, so we fit in, but at the end we are not belong to anywhere. Like there's no belonging when we try to fit in.
Yeah, and it makes me think also, like, and maybe this was just in my own head, but I remember feeling like, well, if I do say something, I felt like people would have thought that I was kind of creating trouble or being negative, right? And complaining. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm sure there's been times where I wanted to say something and speak up and I didn't. And looking back now, I'm like, oh, I should have said something, So.
Yeah.
And Nicole, what do you think organizations or leader could do to effectively create more belonging within their organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I believe that you need to hear from the people at your organization, right? So depending on your place of work, I think hearing from your individual. So that could be interviews, focus groups, surveys, but really hearing from them, because I'm just thinking, I work with some organizations that do that kind of survey, a general maybe engagement survey or something like that, but it's not specific to, as for example, as a woman at your organization, do you feel like you can bring your whole self to work? Do you feel included? Are there any policies that make you feel excluded? I think those are things that organizations can do to really get a pulse on what their employees are thinking and feeling. And I know there's, a lot of organizations do a lot of different surveys, but I don't think, from my understanding, they're doing enough of that type of survey and research into their people. I think that would help. And even just small things, right, that you can do. I'm just thinking of, this organization that I worked at where they only celebrated Christmas holiday. And again, I'm not very religious, but I've worked at other places that had a menorah up for, Hanukkah or other things for other holidays. And it could be something as simple as that, just asking people, talking to people that are different and, hey, can we do anything to help you feel more included?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that really, is such a great first step. In coach training, we are, quite early on, we practice that skill of don't assume, don't try to mind read, and really, ask the right question. And I think it's really a great point, because a lot of organizations are actually putting effort into campaigns, you know, and all that. But the question is actually, have they asked their, you know, their human capital,
yes,
what they need, you know, from the organization.
Right. And then putting it into action, right? I think we're at a time now where people are recognizing that, right? But I feel like it's been a lot of talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and all of that. And companies showing that they care, but employees now seem to be pushing back. In other words, like pushing back to their companies saying, okay, you say you support this, what are you doing about it? We want to see some action. And I think that's going to continue. I think, you know, younger people, when they're interviewing, they're asking those kinds of questions, like, well, how diverse is your company? What are you doing about that to improve diversity or inclusion, et cetera? So I hope that continues, where people are actually doing something about it, not just, you know, saying lip service, I guess.
Have the freedom to speak up. Now now, as you mentioned before, now maybe 10 even 20 years ago, we ourselves we wouldn't say something, but and now bring it, and this is really the idea now, for everybody to be more comfortable with this vocabulary, these languages, to have these conversations.
Yeah, and it makes me think again, like when you were asking, you know, what I think the question was something like, you know, what does belonging mean to me, or what do I think of when I think of belonging? And I think it's also what you just said, Andrea, that not being fearful of being able to say how you feel, and also in the moment, right? So I'm seeing that a lot, where, you know, people might a few weeks later, or, you know, a month later, on the, you know, one-on-one with their supervisor, they might say, yeah, something happened and I didn't say anything then. And, you know, that's great, they're saying something, but if we can encourage people, I think, to in the moment speak up, I think that would, you know, be ideal, and we'd be able to kind of move the needle forward, and there'd be more people speaking up. So
creating that culture that it's all right to speak up, it's all right to say what you think. There won't be any consequences, because often there's that fear that something may happen, that maybe if I say something, I'm not going to be eligible for the promotion, and all those things may not happen. But I think there's been instances where it did happen, and it just kind of leaves, you know, some remnant there for the people.
Absolutely.
So let's get to our final questions, like the quick answers and questions. And really here the idea is to bring what comes here to you in the moment. So in a few words, I know that we talk a lot about this before, but just to bottom line, let's say in a few words, belonging for me is
being able to be myself and be honest and open about that without fear of any repercussions.
Beautiful. That's very powerful. The best advice I receive and I'd like to share with others is?
Oh, that's a hard one, and this is kind of a longer answer, but I think it's to not always go with your gut feeling. And so I think that, and I say this, I don't know if this is true, but I think for women especially, we might struggle with that as younger women. And then we are taught, no, go with your gut feeling, trust your instinct. And I think that's true in a lot of ways. But when we're dealing with people from other cultures and other backgrounds, and we are kind of making judgments, quick snap judgments about people, I think we actually have to check those initial gut reactions and gut feelings about people. So that's something that I think is really hard to do. And I'm constantly battling that within myself. So
that's really good. That's really good. And lastly, the world will be a better place if.
Oh God, I think that's the hardest. I think that's the hardest question. The world would be a better place if there was less judgment about other people, right? And we know that there's differences, and it's just, it's automatic that we tend to judge other people based on, our lens and our culture and all of that. But I think we can be different. We can recognize there are differences, right? But what do we do and how do we recognize those differences? I think if we stopped judging and, saying that one is good or bad or better or worse, I think that would improve the world a lot.
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been a real pleasure to have you here and have this conversation with you. And definitely so many different strategies here that you've shared. And for sure, there's a lot from the intercultural field that we can take and learn when we look at belonging and belonging in our life and what that means to us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.